Hey, sixth graders, welcome back to history. Today we are going to be talking about the culture of Egypt. Now, this is going to be a little bit different. We don't have a pyramid page in our SAM to work on. Instead, what we've got is a crossword puzzle. And all of the answers to this crossword puzzle are going to be found in the pages that we're going to be covering in this lesson today. So in your book, page 75, we'll be covering some things, pages 75 through 79. And everything that we talk about will be an answer on your crossword puzzle. I'll be writing things on the board, and those will be answers for your crossword puzzle, but I'm not going to tell you which number they are. I want you to go back and use this crossword puzzle as kind of a review of the section. So let's get started. When we talk about the culture of Egypt, it's kind of easy to go, wait, I thought that this culture lasted for thousands of years, so I thought this civilization lasted for thousands of years, so how can you talk about the culture of Egypt and it being the same for that long? Egypt is a really interesting, pardon me, a really interesting civilization because of how little it changed over that time period. There were some discoveries, some changes, but basically the fashion, the religion, the art all stayed pretty close to the same throughout this time period. There are some minor differences, and someone that's an Egyptologist would be able to tell you that. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm just somebody who enjoys reading about Egypt and teaching about it. So let's talk about the culture of Egypt. I'm going to make sure I have my dry erase marker. The social structure of ancient Egypt is arranged in a triangular fashion. I'm going to go ahead and draw this on the board. And it's something that you could call a social pyramid. Now, the social pyramid means that everybody fits into basically a group on this pyramid. At the bottom, you have farmers, merchants, servants, and slaves. So at the very bottom, farmers, merchants, servants, and slaves. These are the people who do most of the work, and these are the people who make up the largest social class. The next level, you have people like the priests and the scribes and soldiers and artisans, people who make things. The next level are the nobles. I actually write the whole word out because there's not as much. And generals and viziers. That's a Z. A vizier is an advisor to the pharaoh. Viziers were the highest ranking officials underneath the pharaoh. And then at the top of the pyramid, you have the royal family and you have Pharaoh himself, or herself if you're Hatshepsut. Okay? And that's what the social pyramid looked like. Now, the royal family, and I'm going to write this over here because this is important. The royal family, of course, is the pharaoh and his children and grandchildren and so on. One of the things that's different about ancient Egypt than some of the other cultures we are going to study is that if you worked hard, you could move out of your social class and move up. Anyone from a lower class could rise to a higher class if you caught the pharaoh's notice, caught his attention and obtained his favor. Even a foreign slave could rise to power. In fact, we know this from the biblical story of Joseph. Joseph was a Hebrew slave who ended up being the second most powerful person in Egypt. Also, something unique in a good way about Egypt was that women could hold important roles. Women in ancient Egypt were allowed to buy and sell property. They could work as a farmer or a merchant. They could work at other jobs. And there were even some who served as priestesses in the temple. So women were not as much property of men in ancient Egypt as they were in some other cultures. Women were still not typically as powerful or held in high esteem as men were, but in ancient Egypt it was much better than in some of the other cultures that we're going to study. One of the things that was very important in ancient Egyptian culture was music. Now, I love music, and I don't know very many people who don't. Most people have some kind of music that they really, really enjoy, and the ancient Egyptians were no different. It was part of their everyday life, right? Some cultures, music was strictly religious or had ceremonial value. In ancient Egypt, it was part of their everyday life and special occasions. They were a singing culture. People would sing. Farmers would sing while they worked in the field. Children would sing while they played. Slaves would sing. The pharaoh and the royal family would often have musicians come in to entertain them. So music was kind of permeated all through Egyptian society. So everyday life, yes, but also important in their religious ceremonies. Religious ceremonies used songs of praise to their gods and also songs of prayer to their gods. One of the main themes in ancient Egyptian music was, of course, the Nile River. The Nile River, you will remember, incredibly important to ancient Egypt, and so, and there was a god of the Nile, and so people, because they worshipped the Nile, of course they would sing hymns to the Nile. In fact, you may remember back here, way back at the beginning, when we were talking about the Nile River, on page 57, there's a translation of a hymn to the Nile, and you could go back and read that on page 57. Now, daily life in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians were a very clean people. They bathed often, and if you were a person of a certain economic status and could afford many different changes of clothes, you of course would change clothes every day. And even the slaves, right, had more than one change of clothes, and so they were able to wear clean clothes every day. Their clothing was made out of linen or cotton or wool, and actually in some ancient Egyptian ruins they've even found washrooms. So if you keep in mind that idea, you could kind of think about how awful the plagues must have been for them, right? These are very clean people, and yet they have a plague of lice, and they have a plague of flies, they have a plague of frogs, and so some of the plagues were probably pretty, they were all kind of awful, but even more kind of attacking the Egyptians where it would really hurt their pride in their cleanliness. Egyptian people loved to wear wigs. Both men and women wore wigs. You can look on page 76 for some example of some hairstyles. These wigs would be made out of human hair and out of beeswax. Women would wear their hair long. Men would either wear their hair just above their shoulders, and you can see that in this picture on 76, or they would wear it shaved. They would shave their head. Men and women also wore makeup. Now, in our society, most of the time, men don't wear makeup unless they are part of a theater or a filming group. But in ancient Egypt, this was something that both men and women did. In fact, they wore, and you may recall seeing in some pictures of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics or paintings of life in the pyramids that they had these really strong black lines around their eyes. Well, they wore that in real life. They used a cosmetic powder called kohl. Kohl. It's actually kind of like the store Kohl's is how it's spelled. But kohl was this black powder, and they would use it to paint around their eyes to make their eyes look bigger. One of the other things that kohl did was it actually helped reduce the glare from the sun. You may recall, if you've ever seen a football game or a baseball game, you may see some of the players will have a black mark under their eyes, and that actually helps reduce the glare of the sun. So that made their eyes look bigger, and it had a practical application of helping them see. Egyptians loved perfumes. Special occasion wigs that a woman might wear would have a perfume cone on top of it, and the perfume cone would be made out of some kind of animal fat that was highly scented, and as the fat would melt over the course of the time she was wearing it, the scent would be released into the air. Kind of interesting. I mean, you look at it and you're like, she's got this blob on her head, but that was fashionable then. I suppose we probably have some fashions now that ancient Egyptians would look at and go, that's kind of weird. Some other things to know about everyday life in ancient Egypt. What did they eat? Well, one of their main things that they ate, one of their most important things that they ate was, of course, bread. They made their bread, much like we do, out of wheat or barley. They also had a lot of vegetables that they ate, or if you want to argue about it, fruits, because we're talking about melons, different kinds of melons. They ate cucumbers, dates and figs were very popular in this area of the world, still are, and of course, onions. They also ate lots of fish and lots of different kinds of waterfowl. So that would be birds that made their home along the river. So ducks and geese and things like that. What did they wear? Well, Egyptians wore, as I said before, wore clothing made out of linen. And linen is a fabric that originally was made from flax. I'm going to write this up here. Flax. That's an F. Oh my goodness. That just ended up looking worse than... Let's try that again, shall we? Flax. Flax is a plant that you can actually weave into a kind of cloth, and that's traditionally what linen was made out of. Nowadays, most linen is made out of cotton. But men would wear skirts that wrapped around their waist and would tie it with a belt. Women wore long dresses that were sleeveless. Little children didn't wear any clothes until they were old enough to go to school, and then once they were old enough to go to school, they dressed exactly the same way adults did. Men and women wore jewelry. They liked to wear necklaces, were very popular in ancient Egypt, and they were made out of gold and different kinds of beads from precious stones, or different kinds of rock that they would make these polished beads out of. The necklaces would often have a large pendant. You can see my necklace has a pendant. My pendant is fairly small. The pendants that the Egyptians would wear would be, probably 2 or 3 times this size. And it was for a specific reason. These large pendants, these ornaments, were called amulets. And amulets had supposedly a magical power that would protect whoever wore it from evil spirits. You can see on page 76 a picture of an amulet that is in the shape of a scarab, which is a particular kind of beetle. This is a theme that you'll see a lot in ancient Egyptian art. Egyptians believed that they would be rewarded after they died according to the good things that they had done, and so they put a lot of effort into preparing for their afterlife. Boys went to school, girls did not. Boys of upper class families started school around age 4 or 5. So that's when they had to start wearing clothes, was age 4 or 5. If you were part of the middle class or the lower class, you did not attend school even if you were a boy. Boys in the middle class and the lower class would learn their trade from their dad. So if your dad was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith. If your dad was a merchant, you were a merchant, that kind of thing. Girls, it didn't matter whether you were from the nobility or from any other class, would be taught at home by your mother. So if you were a girl and you learned to read and write, that was only because your mother could read and write. Girls were trained about how to run a household. And in ancient Egypt, most girls got married around age 13, which we think, oh, that's crazy. And it kind of is, but that was the case back then. Everyone worked for the pharaoh. And I'm going to write him on here because that's actually one of the answers for the crossword puzzle. Everyone worked for the pharaoh. People were paid with food and clothing rather than money, which is interesting. And most of the people were farmers or laborers. And that's this, I wish I had drawn my pyramid a little bit bigger at the base, because this is the largest group of people, the farmers and the merchants and the slaves and the laborers. Let's talk about Egyptian religion. This is fascinating to me. And as a Christian, I understand that there is one true God. I'm going to erase our little social pyramid here. I understand that there's one true God, but the ancient Egyptians did not know God. Now, they had seen his power, obviously, in the 10 plagues, but they were stubborn and continued to worship their own false gods. Egyptians were polytheistic. This is something that you probably knew already, but Egyptians were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. Egyptians had hundreds of gods, and this is going to be kind of a theme throughout many of the societies and civilizations we're going to study. Lots and lots of gods. Every village had its own god. Every city had its own god. They had gods of the land. They had gods of the moon, the sun, the stars. They had gods for daily activities. There was a god, obviously, for the Nile. There was a god for farming. There was a god for horses. There was a god for just about everything you can think of. There was a god for it. Families, it was very common for families to have an altar set up in their home where they would worship their favorite gods. Obviously, if you were a farmer, you would want to worship the god that was in charge of the rain, or the god that was in charge of crops, because you would want them to look on you favorably so that you would have a good crop. The Egyptians did believe that there was a god named Ra, who was the sun god, and he created the world and ruled the whole world. During the Middle Kingdom, there were some priests in the city of Thebes, and they joined their god Amun to Ra, and they called this god Amun-Ra. They also told everyone how to worship the new god, which made them very powerful. So when we think about that, because if you're dependent on the goodwill of the gods to make your life good, but you don't know what they want, right? They didn't have a book that told them how to behave in life. They didn't have a Bible like we do that tells us what God wants from us, that God has stopped and taken the time to tell us what he wants from us. They didn't have that. All they had were the priests, and the priests were the only ones who knew what the gods wanted, right? So the people would try to get the priests to favor them, and this ended up giving the priests a lot of power. They were very powerful people. One of the favorite gods kind of overall in Egypt was the god named Osiris. And Osiris was, let me stop and make sure I spelled that correctly. Osiris was the god of the underworld. He was the god that ruled the people who had died. So what the Egyptians believed about death was that after you were buried, the dead person, when they'd get in a boat and travel by boat to a place called the Hall of Judgment. And this was where Osiris would sit in judgment. There was another god named Anubis. And Anubis had the head of a jackal, which is a kind of wild dog, and the body of a man. And Anubis would weigh the dead person's heart against the feather of truth. The feather of truth. It was the feather of justice, order, and truth, but many places they just shorten it to the feather of truth, right? So there was one of those scales, right, that goes like this, and so they would put your heart on one side and the feather on the other side, and if your heart was heavier than this feather, then you had committed more bad things than good things. So, you would have to really hope that you had done enough good things in your life to make your heart light. One of the other interesting things is most Egyptians were buried with a scroll, which would have been a papyrus copy of a very special book. It was called the Book of the Dead. And what this did was it was instructions for you for how you were supposed to behave after you died. What did you need to do after you died? So when your heart is being weighed, the kinds of things you would need to say, the kinds of things you would need to do. On page 77, there is a bit of translation from the book, and this is what a person is supposed to chant to declare his innocence during judgment. So while Anubis is weighing your heart against the feather of truth, you would say, I have not committed sins against men. I have not made any man to weep. I have not committed murder. I have not given the order for murder to be committed. I have not caused calamities to befall men and women. I have not carried away the milk from the mouths of children. I have not driven the cattle away from their pastures. I have not snared the geese in the goose pens of the gods. I have not stopped water when it should flow. I have not made a cutting in a canal of running water. I am pure. I am pure. I am pure. And that was what a person would have chanted as they were being judged. There was another goddess who was the wife of Osiris, and her name was Isis, and she was the protector of children. Now, they had a son named Horus, and you can look on page 78 to see a picture of Isis and a picture of Horus. And Horus had the head of a falcon and the body of a man, and Osiris, Isis, and Horus modeled what the Egyptians believed were the ideal family, and this was the family that Egyptian families were to model themselves after. There were other gods and goddesses, like I said before, medicine, music, education, love. There was the goddess of love was Hathor, and she had the body of a woman and the head of a cow. So there you go. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the son of Horus, which made the pharaoh a god, and the pharaoh was the high priest of Egypt. So not only was the pharaoh in charge of politics and in charge of law and in charge of the military, but pharaoh was also in charge of the religion. So every morning, the pharaoh had to get up and bathe, and then had to go to the temple and wake up the idol of Horus. And the way he would do that is he would wash the idol and put clean clothes on it, give it some food, and put makeup on it. So put the coal around the eyes. And then, and only then, could the day go on with the blessing of the gods. If you look on page 78, you'll see the temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt, still standing. They really built things to last, didn't they? One of the things I want you to look at on your own time, so when you have some extra time, when you're done with all of your other schoolwork, you can open your textbook to page 413. In the back of your book, we have a bunch of primary sources. And on page 413 is a translation of some pyramid texts. These are things that are written inside the walls of certain pyramids, and they're prayers and songs and spells. And it's kind of interesting to read. So if you have some extra time when you're done with your other schoolwork, you could go to page 413 and read a little bit more about what the ancient Egyptians believed. Now, the ancient Egyptians were very set in their belief systems, but there was one pharaoh that came along that tried to change those beliefs. His name was Amenhotep IV, and he had a belief, and I'm actually not sure where he got it, because his father didn't believe this, but he believed that there was only one great God, and that God's name was Aton. And so he changed his own name. He changed his name to Akhenaten to show that he was a follower of Aten or Aton. I'm gonna write that, Akhenaten. And so you can see there that he included that God's name in his name, Akhenaten. And the priests of the old gods did not like the fact that they had lost their power and their prominence, of course. And the Egyptian people did not want to give up their old gods. And so when he died, the pharaoh that came after him was actually Tutankhamun. We talked about him before. And Tutankhamun actually returned things to the old religion. You can actually see on page 79 a relief carving that shows Akhenaten. Ancient Egypt was a great civilization for a very, very long time. Centuries, millennia. But obviously its greatness couldn't last forever. There's no civilization that has lasted forever. God allowed Egypt to fall to some other people. We'll talk about those other people, the Cushites, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. God tells us in Ezekiel 29 that he had judged the Egyptians for their worship of false gods. But Isaiah tells of a time when Egypt will actually turn back to God and God will heal them. So that's, I think, a really great promise for all of us, is that if we turn to God, he will heal us. One other thing I want to point out, as you are reading through your book, be sure to read the green boxes. So for instance, on page 79, you will see a green box. Be sure to read the information there. This one has information about Egyptian religious beliefs and compares it to Christian beliefs. And you'll want to have that information as you're working on your study guides. Now, I do want to say that if you have some extra time each day, you could spend some extra time working on your study guides in your SAM. They are, let's see, pages 32 and 41 and 42 and 45 and I think that's it. Nope, and 49. So those pages are study guides, and you are allowed to use those on the test at the end of the chapter. So make sure you do a little bit each day on some of those study guides so that you don't fall behind and have to do them all at the end. And the next time we come together, we will talk about the kingdom of Cush and the influence of Cushite culture on the ancient Egyptians, and I'll see you next time.